All right, and I think this is going to be the last lecture right now. For now, probably for this semester on the Civil War. There's a lot more we could say, but time's running short, and I'm sort of coming to the end of these slides that I had prepared over the last few years. This is from a lesson going back to my West Point teaching days called Towards Union Victory. And, of course, you have Grant photographed at the end of the Overland Campaign. I think this was after Cold Harbor, but before the Petersburg Campaign, I'm pretty sure. He's looking exhausted. His uniform looks pretty muddy. As usual with Grant, the only way you know that he's a figure of consequence is that he has the shoulder straps of a lieutenant general, of which he was the only one in the U.S. military at that time. Congress revived the rank specifically for him so he could, without question, outrank everyone else in the U.S. military. On the right, of course, you have Lee. This was taken, I think, not too long after Appomattox, so he's still in Confederate gray. At this point in 1964, he's from the winter, I think it was the winter of 1963, spring of 1964. I'm trying to remember when this happened. Something happens, we think it was a heart attack, and Lee's health is somewhat uneven at this point. But as we head into 1964, we have a Confederacy that is very much intact. Grant has a grand plan to coordinate offensive operations across the entirety of the front. And also remember, Grant's also responsible for operations in Texas, Oklahoma territories, all the way out in Nevada, California, even the Pacific Northwest. So Grant's final report, which is included in his memoirs, is very far-ranging. But the core of what's going to happen, everybody knows, is going to be Sherman and Meade. All the other offensives are important. Mobile is a very heavily defended port. This is going to have some of the legendary history of the U.S. Navy emerge from this. But the main thing is going to be Meade and Sherman. So how does this actually work? Well, what happens starting the night of May 4th, 1864, is something which a lot of military observers were somewhat surprised at. This was something new, or not necessarily, well, the closest thing to it would have been the Waterloo Campaign in 1815, and the Waterloo Campaign was over pretty quickly, and that is what we call continuous operations. Rather than the previous form of operations, which involve two armies maneuvering, there might be a couple small clashes, but you'll have one big clash, and then one army or the other will withdraw or retreat, and then you'll continue on from there. What's called the Overland Campaign, which ends with the crossing of the James River, and then you have the first assault on Petersburg from June 15th to 18th. This is certainly to Cold Harbor. This is 30-plus days of continuous operations. There is no end to the fighting. It's a tempo of continuous action, which no one really is ready for, and no one certainly in the U.S. or Confederate militaries has ever seen. Even observers, European observers, are taking note of this. So you have the Battle of the Wilderness, you have Spotsylvania Courthouse, which goes on for almost 2 weeks. And then March, North Anna River. This is actually a very interesting engagement. It's almost a massive. Lee almost catches the Union Army in two divided wings that can't help each other. Some people like to say, "Oh, this was it. If he hadn't fallen sick, he could have just." No, the Union Army's entrenched as well. This would not have worked. Although they probably would have inflicted severe casualties. Totopotomy Creek, a lot of maneuvering. Yellow Tavern, May 11th. Sheridan finally catches up with Jeb Stuart. Stuart's mortally wounded in this battle. Cold Harbor is the last major offensive. If you've ever been out in that area, there is a small, there's a good short driving trail and a small visitor center. And then Grant does one of what is really a remarkable thing. He manages to cross the bulk of his army over the James River on this pontoon bridge, and it's only because of the caution of his commanders that they don't take Petersburg right away. And if you're from the greater Petersburg area, you'll recognize a number of these. Drury's Bluff, Bermuda Hundred shows up, Newmarket Heights, Fort Harrison. And then once you get to Petersburg, then you have all the events of the Siege of Petersburg. What's the actual result of the Overland Campaign? And I'm not going to dwell on the specific actions of the Battle of the Wilderness. I've done this sort of before. We'll pause at Spotsylvania. This is the Mule Shoe Salient. If you visit Spotsylvania, you can see all the entrenchments here that are almost perfectly intact. Certainly the earth berms, as well as the revetments, which were constructed so that if the enemy jumped over the berm and took part of it, they couldn't fire down the length of the entrenchment, and you could stop them at these little revetments. From the air, it looks like a centipede. This is my own. This is my own photograph of this. I'm trying to remember what the perspective on this is. Okay, we'll go back one. So, actually, we'll go back to the overall campaign. What's the result of this? The result of this is about 55,000 casualties for the Union Army, about 35,000 for Lee. There have been some recent studies that have revised Lee's casualty figures upwards considerably. Lee is he starts off with about 60,000. He's reinforced to about 75,000. Grant has about 118,000 all told. So Meade's Army of the Potomac 92 plus Burnside, which is about 27,000. So in other words, minus Burnside, Lee and Meade are basically back to Gettysburg levels. Lee's army is pinned down in siege operations basically till the end of the war. He does detach Jubal Early's corps to go to the Shenandoah to turn the tide there, which he does. And eventually Grant detaches Sheridan to go deal with Early, and that's Cedar Creek, the Battle of Winchester, Cedar Creek. And if you're been in the Shenandoah, there's actually some good national battlefield parks there to help you orient yourself. Northern morale wavers. You could say it wavers. A lot of the pictures, photographs coming out of this, newspapers won't even print them. There's a certain horrificness to the Wilderness battle where an awful lot of wounded perish in the forest fires that begin, that break out. This is where you start hearing Grant called a butcher. You can't hide these casualties or expect them not to make an impression on the public consciousness because they're too close to Washington for that. Lee is both frustrated and sort of grudgingly admiring of Grant in this. He doesn't think Grant he doesn't think Grant has any ability. He's like, this guy just keeps using numbers. But on the other hand, he also, especially when Grant turns south again after Spotsylvania, Lee begins to realize he's dealing with a very different Union general, because Lee and most of the Union Army thought after the Wilderness that they the army thought, oh, now they'll just retreat back north over the Rappahannock River up here, and it's basically Hooker all over again. It's Hooker, it's McClellan, it's Burnside, it's every commander they've had. They'll cross the river, they'll have a battle, they'll get beaten up a bit, then they'll retreat further north. And when it becomes clear, when they turn right to head south instead of turning left to head back north, there's this huge morale jump in the army. And Lee is sort of waiting to see what Grant's going to do. He does have stationed some troops at Spotsylvania on the hunch that Grant might turn south. And when he does, that's kind of Lee's confirmation. He's dealing with a different Union commander here. This is not a Hooker. This is not a Burnside or a McClellan. This is someone who's going to keep going. And in one sense, Lee's feeling on this is, wow, they finally have somebody who did what they should have been trying to do the last couple of years. As it becomes clearer that Grant is getting closer and closer to the James River, Lee's starting to get very worried because they have to defend Petersburg. If you're going to hold Richmond, you have to defend Petersburg because that's your supply hub. If they can't, and he says this to A.P. Hill, I think when they're somewhere around either North Anna or Totopotomoy Creek, he says, we have to stop him before he gets to the James, because if he does, then it'll be a siege, and then it's just a matter of time. So you have two commanders who kind of understand each other very well, and they're both thinking in kind of high levels. Lee's army performs pretty well on the whole. Army of the Potomac is very uneven. The Wilderness, actually, Lee's attempt here, he's outnumbered 2-1, and he attempts to take the Union Army on both flanks. It's kind of typical Lee. It's the last time the Army of Northern Virginia is going to be able to do that. So very unsatisfying from both perspectives. No one is very happy with what happens in the Overland Campaign. The Siege of Petersburg is going to be a long, drawn-out affair. Grant keeps probing. We have the Battle of the Crater. We have the Weldon Railroad battlefield, which is actually the RBC campus is sort of part of that. Most of the action happened just north of the RBC property. But the fighting is ferocious beyond what had happened in 1963. Now, Sherman, on the other hand, as you can see, Sherman is taking his time here. By May 7th, they're at Dalton. May 13th, Resaca, and so on and so forth. Johnson keeps falling back. The big stopping point, and Davis is getting increasingly nervous. When are you going to hold in front of Atlanta? Finally, Kennesaw Mountain. This is the main defensive line, and there's still a lot of positions there. You can go visit and tour these battlefields. Pins Sherman down for over a month. You can see not until July do they get going again. And eventually Johnson's relieved. Hood is put in charge. Hood was an outstanding division commander, a so-so corps commander, not the world's best army commander, and he goes on the offensive. He attacks Sherman's forces in various places, and he just loses a lot of troops. So Peachtree Creek and then Ezra Church, basically Sherman is cutting off Atlanta, and then September 1, Atlanta's abandoned. Sherman's already bombarded Atlanta. This causes a lot of controversy. This is a very famous letter from the city alderman of Atlanta, the city officials. They send a letter to Sherman saying, look, you bombarded the city. Now you're demanding the whole city be evacuated. Look, this is not how you need to treat the civilian population better. This isn't right. We talk about charity and decency. And Sherman's response to this is quite fascinating. Sherman's letters in general are fascinating, but he says, don't even go down that road with me. We didn't start this war. You all wanted this. Civilian population. We're calling for it. I think you should get as much as you wanted. This is where you get some of these things. War is cruel. You cannot refine it. And the more people understand that war is just absolute horror, the better it will be, because then the fewer people will clamor for it. This is not isolated behavior to this sort of bombarding of cities. This is not isolated to the Civil War. I mean, the Prussians do this at Paris in 1870, and they have much longer range guns. So as you head into the autumn of late summer of 64, nothing really works. Sigel's being driven out of the Shenandoah. Banks' operations in Mobile have gone nowhere. Butler's Army of the James has gone nowhere. Grant and Meade have taken 55,000 casualties, and in addition, an awful lot of veterans did not renew their expiring 3-year enlistments. And then Sherman is just creeping along in a very narrow terrain, very narrow passes. He has to be supplied by rail because there's not enough there to live off the land. Lincoln's looking at this and he's saying, well, I'm probably going to lose the election in 64. A reasonable answer to the question from last lesson, which was, can the Confederacy actually win in 64? The reasonable answer to that question is they have a chance until the November elections, the presidential election of 64. At the point that Lincoln and the Republican Party, Lincoln's returned to office and the Republican Party is returned with major majorities, or enough significant majorities in House and Senate, indicate that that's basically it. The South, the Confederacy will not win this conflict, because after the most horrific summer you could imagine, the people of the United States returned the president and his party to power. So if that's not a vote of confidence, then what is? It means that Lincoln doesn't have to worry about negotiating. He doesn't have to placate the Democrats in Congress. And of course, the Democrat who's running against him in 64 is George B. McClellan, the former commander of the Army of the Potomac, who all but guarantees a negotiated settlement to end the war should he win. And at the point that Lincoln wins, that's basically it for the Confederacy. It's just a matter of time. Maybe you can change some of the terms that will be offered. Maybe you can influence the post-war settlement with how defeat happens. But the idea that the Union armies are somehow going to pack up and go home and give up the fight, simply not going to happen. Not going to happen after November 64. And then, of course, Sherman cuts loose, does his march to the sea, which is tremendously destructive of military resources. The sort of popular image of Sherman's utter destruction of Georgia is actually not true. That's actually more what Sheridan does to the Shenandoah Valley. Sherman actually, they take the chickens, they take the pigs, they take the donkeys, they take the corn, but that's nothing the Confederate government wasn't already doing. And they overwhelmingly focus on destroying military infrastructure. Sherman actually knows that whole area of Georgia, where he goes, better than any of the Confederate commanders do, because he was the U.S. Army officer responsible for surveying that area for official atlases and ordnance survey maps before the war. So he's going through territory. He doesn't even really need that. He knows what's there. So as you go into 65, you have a couple interesting things happening. Sherman has reached the sea. He's reached the Atlantic. He's getting ready to turn up into the Carolinas. The Army of the Potomac and Army of the James are getting ready to, preparing for the spring campaigns against the Army of Northern Virginia. Mobile Bay falls in February 65. Fort Fisher falls. That guards the approaches to Wilmington. That's the Confederacy's last window to the outside world. If you've ever been to Wilmington and visited Fort Fisher, it is well worth your time. There's an excellent exhibit in the visitor center, and you can walk around the entire fort. It's in some ways similar to the Fort Wagner, which features in the movie Glory. You can understand the movie Glory, the tactical problem, a lot better if you visit Fort Fisher, and I highly recommend it. That falls. It's a major combined operation. The U.S. Navy at this point is the largest Navy in the world, and they are very adept at naval operations. Big chunks of the Confederacy remain untouched, or largely untouched. But it's looking like the end is certainly going to come. There's an interesting phenomenon that sweeps through a number of Confederate units. Pamplin Park has a great exhibit on of these things. They don't always have it out. They rotate the exhibit materials in the last room before you leave the museum exhibit parts. But they have had this out before. These are the declarations, the recommitment oaths. Whole regiments take these oaths, and they have a declaration of principles about why the cause matters, and they're still true. And it's a fascinating window into sort of the military, the Confederate military's mentality as to how they are regarding or thinking of what the Confederate cause is, or what they want to actually, what they want to publicly say it is, as the last 4 months of the war are getting underway. It's a fascinating thing to see all these different sort of recommitment oaths of allegiance. The other thing that's happening, and this has led to one of the most pernicious myths of the war, is you're starting to hear some more conversations about whether or not, to solve its manpower problem, the Confederacy shouldn't arm and train the enslaved as units in the Confederate military, and in return for military service, you get your freedom. This has led to completely baseless claims that tens of thousands of slaves fought for the Confederacy. Kevin Levin is a pretty prominent historian of the conflict. Has basically done a whole book. He published a book last year on this, which is the myth of the Black Confederates. You do see a lot of people who have been mistaken for Black Confederate soldiers. They're almost always, or exclusively, the personal servants or personal slaves of the sort of the white man in the picture. Yes, Lee's army ran on sort of, I guess you would call it, yes, it was enslaved labor, particularly for its logistics. The Teamsters, sort of the mule drivers of the Army of Northern Virginia's supply trains, they're almost all black, or not almost all, but a lot of them were. And of course, there's a great project called Visualizing Emancipation, which charts Union Army interactions with the enslaved, and also Confederate Army interactions. And one thing you get very clearly from this is how the Confederate military uses enslaved laborers to build fortifications. They'll commandeer slaves off of plantations if they need to use the manpower for construction projects. They're not soldiers. by early 65, there is talk of this, but the Confederate government is rather cool to the idea. Lee is at the point where he's seriously he's considering it anyway. I don't know how serious he was. And it leads to, I think there's a realization you can sort of see seeping through high-level Confederate leadership, which is that they really jumped the gun on this. Because if you're even thinking, like the whole reason that you went to war was to preserve the institution of slavery, because Lincoln presented an existential threat to this, to this whole system. You've enshrined white supremacy in your Constitution. You've given speeches about how the whole point of this is to correct this sort of softness on this hostility to slavery, which existed within the U.S. from the very beginning, from its foundations, which kind of proved, in a sense, Frederick Douglass's point about the Constitution being an anti-slavery document, in a way. But now in 65, you have people seriously thinking, well, you know what? We're not even sure if the institution necessarily has to survive in order for the sort of racial hierarchies to be maintained. At which point, there had to have been a lot of thinking, well, what did we do this for anyway? So there's a lot of weird dynamics going on in the Confederacy in 65. As it happens, the fall of the Confederacy happens very quickly. On March 31st, Lee's position is very much intact. April 1st, Sheridan destroys Pickett's command at Five Forks. April 2nd, U.S. Sixth Corps breaks through the Confederate lines at Pamplin Park. That's one reason why Pamplin Park has this kind of the position that it does. Grant orders an assault along the line. Lee decides he has to evacuate as soon as possible. He sends a message to Davis, who's in church. You need to leave now. And it's at this point that, a lot of stuff begins to fall apart for the Army of Northern Virginia. His men are malnourished. Of course, they've also been sitting for months. They're not used to marching quickly anymore. They don't have those abilities. It's not been helped by a steady deterioration of diet. Lee having to spread men out, one man per, 10 yards, one man per 20 yards, if you take the entire whole frontage he has to cover. So you have malnourishment, you have the fact that his army has been sitting for months and now has to move and march very rapidly. It's not used to that anymore. And then the other thing that happens is the staff work of the Army of Northern Virginia falls apart. You can't make some of this stuff up. Elizabeth Varron, in her book on Appomattox, drew attention to the people who were in the room at various points with Grant and Lee as the surrender terms are being written out and reviewed and modified and signed and so on. And she points out that it's not just the military might of the Union Army, which was represented by the various cavalry, infantry, artillery commanders there, but also the organizational abilities of the Union Army, their supply abilities, their technological or technical arms, their engineering abilities. Union military abilities are peaking at the point that Lee's military abilities and instrument have sort of reached their lowest ebb. The whole point of the design behind Lee's retreat was to get to Amelia Courthouse, resupply there, and then keep going. They get to Amelia Courthouse, and there's no supply trains, as in actual locomotive trains. Where are the supplies? Well, the quartermaster never sent them because he was AWOL. He was absent. He decided, you know what? I'm gonna get married. My fiance and I have waited for a long time. Who knows what's going to happen? Let's get married. And so he kind of disappears. He gets married, and he's not attending to his duties at this very vital point in the existence of the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee waits around Amelia Courthouse because he has no idea. Are they gonna? If we move out now, we have no food. What if they're running a few hours late? And that's one reason why Grant can catch him, because he waits. He loses that advantage. Now Grant's forces were going to catch the Confederate Army at some point. Sheridan was absolutely adamant about this, but they were not going to stop until they caught up with Lee. But it's sort of indicative of how, when push comes to shove, the Army of Northern Virginia is as inefficient as any Yankee army for much of this, for much of the conflict. And it's inefficient at precisely the moment when it can't afford to be inefficient, whereas the Union Army is much more efficient. So you also have to remember at Appomattox, there's all the stories about the Union troops giving the Confederates their rations. Union troops were exhausted as well. They were also starving because, when you're eating your emergency rations, which they were, you've outrun your supplies. So they're exhausted, they're starving, and they're getting very strung out as well. So Appomattox is a much more complicated picture than you might expect. Lee starts off. He leaves his siege lines with about 65,000 troops. He surrenders to about 29,000, or give or take, at Appomattox. What happened to the rest of them? About 7,000 of them were captured at Sailor's Creek, which was the last major engagement between the two armies. Some thousands were killed or wounded. An awful lot just deserted. So, more than half of Lee's force is killed, wounded, captured, or deserted by the time he's trapped at Appomattox. The final attack of the Army of Northern Virginia happens on the morning of April 9th. This is Gordon's units. They push west. If you take Route 460 out to Appomattox and you get off the exit there's the Civil War Museum. Go past that, keep going on that road, and you're basically going to see Custer's positions, Grant's headquarters. Tent is going to be nearby. And then eventually on the left side, you'll see these markers with placards that describe the last attack of the Army of Northern Virginia, sort of coming at you from where the McLean House in Appomattox, the village in Appomattox, is. Union cavalry is screening there. They're pushed back. What the placards don't tell you is that, and it's interesting because they've done a good job of revamping the exhibits in many parts of Appomattox. And Appomattox, is kind of a shrine to the lost cause in many ways. Whether or not the National Park Service whether they try to prevent that or not, it effectively is. Those plaques, explanatory markers, don't tell you that the force that shows up behind the Union cavalry, which causes Gordon to break off the action, is actually black troops from the Army of the James. So black troops are written out of Appomattox very quickly. Elizabeth Varron has a great column on the sort of Oxford University Press blog about this. They're right there. They're key to stopping the last attack of the Army of Northern Virginia, but when you read all the accounts of Appomattox, you'd never know they were there. Quick thing about Appomattox, and then we'll come to an end here. What happened at Appomattox depended on which side you were on. The way Grant saw this, Elizabeth, and I keep coming back to Varron, but her book on she is an absolutely phenomenal historian. She's one of my favorites, and her analysis is second to none on this. Grant sees Appomattox as the North, the Union, being generous to the defeated. You have lost. However, because we want to heal the nation. We have to live with you after the war. We're not going to grind your noses in the dust, but this is conditional on good behavior. not waging war, levying rebellion against the United States anymore. That's what Grant sees has happening at Appomattox, and that's what he's going to take to the North. Lee sees something very, very different, or he insists on seeing something very different, which is the North, the Union Army is somewhat ashamed that it won this victory, which it should not have really been able to do, because, of course, the Army of Northern Virginia was far superior to its opponents. And in recognition of the fact that, the Union cause was really not that good, and that they didn't really defeat the Confederate military, they're giving just terms. I wouldn't say generous, but just terms, and a promise to not interfere with or oppress the now soon-to-be former Confederates. So Confederate compliance is dependent upon Yankee good behavior. It's impossible to get two more diametrically opposed versions and visions of what happens at the now legendary, almost mythological story of the surrender at Appomattox. As you can see, Lee's version is going to be the foundation of the Lost Cause, which takes shape very quickly. Lee kind of aids and abets this, but kind of quietly. There's been a lot of good research on what how he sort of is thinking about this. He never really stops thinking about it. He had given some thought in the 5 remaining years of his life to writing his own account, but he never really does. He was very firmly against monuments, putting up monuments and and that kind of thing. He thought that's not helpful, but he was fully committed to writing and promoting a history of the war in which they were not actually conquered on the battlefield. They were simply overwhelmed and worn down by superior supplies and manpower. It had nothing to do with the military abilities of their opponents. And once you lay that in, then you kind of have it's interesting how this works culturally in the U.S., both post 65 up to sort of the heyday of the Klan, which is the 1930s, when you had almost 4.5 million members of the Klan scattered all over the country, up to today. Once you establish that proposition, I'm not going to say it's a fact because there's copious evidence to the contrary. Once you establish that proposition, then you can begin to rewrite a lot of the rest of the history of the war so that no one remembers Beauregard or Randolph saying that, it's impossible to conquer the Confederacy. Look at the annals of military history. The thing is not possible unless you're not true to the cause. So Lee's General Orders Number 9, which is his last order of the Army of Northern Virginia, kind of lays out the key components of what's going to be the Lost Cause narrative. And also remember, he's not talking to everyone who ever served in the Army of Northern Virginia, just those who served loyally to the end of their service. So he's not really talking to the deserters, and that sort of helps a lot of people elide what actually happened, which is an awful lot of Confederate soldiers just gave up, or there's the whole school of thought that argues this, listen to their wives, who said, you need to get yourself home. You served the cause. That's nice. Well, there's more important things. We need you at home. Your kids need. I need you. Your kids need you. It's time for you to come home. So one version of what happens in the result of the Civil War is the war was over when the white women of the South said it was over. Another version is that the Confederacy died of states' rights, that despite the dictatorial powers of the Confederate government, they were still effectively, too often, fighting as separate states. Another version is that, simply Northern material resources just wore them down. There's other versions, there's one version which is Longstreet messed up at Gettysburg and therefore the South lost the war. And then there's the version that Pickett, who remained a kind of estranged to his fellow Confederate veterans, I think, as I'm recalling in many ways, and certainly bitter to the end of his days. There's what Pickett's version of what happened. He said, "I think the Union Army had something to do with it." So that's where we are now. That's April 9th. The last Confederate Army doesn't surrender until late June. The main thing Lee has decided to not do is a guerrilla war, which is what Grant and Lincoln were afraid of. Davis wants to do it, but Lee's decided he's not going to. He actually breaks with his commander-in-chief at this point. Because, Lee's idea of what he went to war to defend is not so he can sit in a cave up in the Blue Ridge Mountains somewhere, with a bunch of Confederate guerrillas, sitting on an old cracker box. That's not why he went to war. At this point, as I said, they figured, what, we can probably preserve the racial hierarchies anyway. If we come in somewhat graciously and willingly, we can probably shape or even stop this Reconstruction talk. So this is more or less how the Civil War ends, why it ends the way it does, and why it's also significant. It also, I think, shows that Reconstruction is absolutely integral to any study of the Civil War. But we will cover that more after break.